All right, hey folks, Aaron here, and I want to make a video today that even if you've never touched a camera, even if you have zero knowledge of cameras, lenses, photography, anything of that nature, that by the end of this video you will understand what ISO is, what aperture is, and what shutter speed is, and hopefully kind of give you the best explanation possible on how they relate to each other and why they are important in photography. And I'm going to try to do it in the most basic, simple terms, and with demonstrations to take the guesswork out of it. And I don't know, just kind of, because I remember when I first started and I was watching these tutorials and these videos, and I was like, man, none of this makes any sense to me. Okay, you're talking about stuff as if I already know, but I'm watching this tutorial because I don't know. So that's what I want to do. I want to make a video that just the basic, absolute basics. I mean, I don't think it gets any more basic than ISO, shutter speed, and your aperture. If you start there, so let's just start there, okay? Let's start with aperture and go over that. Aperture simply means hole, the hole in the lens. The amount of light that is going to be allowed through the lens. So this aperture here is a large hole. This aperture here is a small hole. So this lens will let in a lot more light. This lens won't. Okay? This is the Canon 50mm. This is the kit lens that comes with it, with the T7i, the SL2, you know, most of the ones. If you're watching this, then you probably have one of those cameras. Now, the larger the hole, the smaller the number, and that is determined by the F on it. So you'll say an f1.8. So when you are looking at lenses to buy and whatnot, you will see a series of numbers on the lens. You'll see the focal distance. So for this one, the Canon 50mm, the 50mm is the focal distance. Then you'll see f1.8, and that is referring to the aperture or the hole in the lens. Now an f1.8 is a large hole. This is an f4.5. It is a small hole. So the f1.8 will let in a lot more light a lot quicker than the f4.5, meaning that this doesn't need as much light. So therefore, because it is a large hole, you will get better photos and things will look better in low light with this because it allows a lot more light in. Okay? So it's very important. The larger the number on this, is kind of backwards. The larger the number for the aperture, the smaller the hole. The smaller the number, the larger the hole. Shutter speed is extremely simple. It's just how fast the shutter inside the camera opens up to capture the image and then closes. I don't even know if it technically opens and closes. Maybe it moves apart, splits. I don't know. I don't know how it works technically, but I know. Let's just say it opens and it closes, and then that is what is allowing the light to come in and allowing the image to be captured. Okay, let's keep it that simple. All right, here's some examples of some shutter speeds. Okay, that's a pretty healthy shutter speed right there. You're gonna get your image pretty quickly. You're not gonna have a lot of blur. However, if you start to hear something along these lines, you hear that drag, that delay here. That is a slow shutter, and you could slow it way down if you'd like. Typically, when you get into a situation where it starts to get too dark, the camera's trying to soak up as much light as it can, and that's when you'll hear that laggy shutter where it's, you hear that? That's just too long. Unless your subject is perfectly still and your camera's really still, you're going to run into some problems. So again, a healthy shutter really quick. Boom, boom. It's opening and shutting real quick. That whatever you're taking a picture of is probably going to be pretty sharp. So that's shutter. It's very simple. And the shutter speed will dictate usually the sharpness of the image, or if you see that blurry, that blurry image, it's usually because your camera's struggling to let in more light and it's getting blurry because it's just the shutter speed is too slow. So that's basically the rundown of shutter speed. Very simple. So the longer that the shutter is open, the more light can come in, and typically the better the image looks with light. However, the longer it's open, the more possibility you have for motion blur. So think of it this way. If you were to count to, say, 4, right? And I'm starting here, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you were to have the shutter open that whole time, it would literally show me blurring across the screen. Now, if you were just to capture me like that right here, the shutter opens and closes like that, it would obviously catch me extremely quickly, capture the image, and I would be frozen, like completely frozen. So it would look sharp. So it's very simple. ISO is the most simple of the three, as all it is digitally brightening your image. It's digital brightness. That's it. I mean, think of it as on a TV set. When you go to your menu and you go to the brightness and you make it really bright. And also think of it this way, when you make that really bright, think of how the image starts to get grainy on your TV. It's the same thing with the camera. The more digital processing involved in adding brightness to an image makes the image look kind of grainy and it kind of deteriorates. So the higher the ISO, the worse the image tends to look above a certain point. So you can add some and it'll look great. You add too much and it starts to really look funky. So ISO is simply digital brightness. The most basic sense, that's what it is. Your camera is digitally brightening the image to hit the exposure to where it looks the most natural or the most evenly exposed. Okay, so this is an example of a very high ISO. I'm going to be at a really low, the lowest ISO here. Got that? Okay, so let's go back to how all these relate to each other. And this is where it gets kind of complicated, but if you know what they all are, you can kind of see how they start to intertwine like that. Okay, so let's say you have a lens that has a very small aperture, like the one I showed you, the f4.5. Remember, the higher number, smaller the aperture. Now, in order to, let's say you're indoors with that lens, okay? Small aperture, indoors. Now, in order to let as much light in as possible, you would have to the shutter would have to stay open for a long time, right? Which you don't want, because the longer the shutter stays open, the more it allows for motion blur. So what does the camera do? The camera will have a quicker shutter and it will bump up the ISO. Okay, it'll digitally compensate, raise that ISO level way up, digitally brighten it, and as a result, the image will look grainy. It'll look over-processed. It'll look like something is wrong with it. It's not very clear. It's not a very good image. Okay, where if you were to use the lens indoors, let's say with the large aperture, then that shutter doesn't have to stay open as long. It can allow a lot more light in. The ISO can stay down, and now you're getting an image that looks fairly decent. So you see how they all kind of relate, how they're all intertwined? That's pretty complicated, isn't it? Okay. Well, I don't know how else to break it down, how I don't know how to break it down any simpler than that. So now there are a lot more things involved that have to do with the blurred background and all that, but that gets a little more complicated. That's more technical. You don't need to know about that to understand the basic principles of ISO, of shutter speed, and of the aperture and how they relate to each other. So like I said, that's my basic purpose of this video, is just to kind of explain what they are and how they can relate to each other and why it's important to understand that, so when you get into photography you are not clueless and you can kind of see, well, shoot, this image is really grainy, so what's going on here? Well, probably because the ISO is too high, because the lens you're using isn't letting enough light in quickly enough. So you have to make some adjustments, which means you could either try to keep the shutter speed open longer to let more light in, but now the image may not be so grainy, but it might be blurry. Or you get a lens that has a larger aperture, larger hole, you let that light in faster, the ISO can stay down to a reasonable level, and you get a much cleaner image that's usable or acceptable to you. Got it? Okay. One other thing, if you are outdoors, most of the time, all these lenses are fine. You don't really have to worry about hardly any of it. The camera will do most of the work for you as a beginner. Obviously, as you get more evolved, you're going to want to mess around with those settings to create that blurry background and maybe get some motion blur, and maybe, you know, you can do all that stuff once you understand how the settings work in relation to each other and how you can manipulate those in the camera. But first, you need to know how the basic settings relate to each other. Okay, so I hope this video helps you out. I hope now you at least have an understanding of what these things mean and how they relate to each other. All right, thank you for watching. Please subscribe. This is Aaron's Practical Reviews, and keep an eye out for more videos to come. Thank you for watching.